Code Geass is easily one of the most iconic anime out there. Even after almost 15 years of its release, Code Geass stands as one of the highest rated series and is even talked about to this day. The reason for its insane popularity comes down to both Lelouch and that ending of season 2. For many people, Lelouch is the best written character of all time. It was his intelligence, charisma and theatrics paired with the seemingly simple yet complex plot of Code Geass that made the anime popular in the first place. The anime itself had an amazing start to its incredibly rich plot filled with interesting characters and a story that quickly unfolded to an impressively large scale. But the reason this anime is hailed as a masterpiece today is because of how Code Geass delivers on what is considered by some as one of the greatest ending to any piece of media ever created, in the form of Zero's Requiem. This great grand conclusion of this 50 episode long ongoing saga left everyone speechless, and it was what cemented Code Geass among the best of the best animes that the world had ever seen. Zero's Requiem perfectly packed and wrapped up the story of Code Geass, and that ending is what most people remember when looking back upon the series. Code Geass truly was a story that never needed a sequel. So they made a Code Geass sequel. In 2016, an entire decade after Code Geass was first released, a 3-part recap movie series alongside a movie titled Lelouch of the Resurrection was announced. This movie was meant to serve as the third installment to this franchise, and as you would imagine, people were pretty excited but at the same time slightly concerned to hear this news. All the signs pointed at the fact that this sequel would probably suck by absolutely shitting on the original series, but there was still that outside chance that it might be good enough for the fans to appreciate it in its own way. And then in 2019, the movie actually came out in the theaters, and nobody cared at all. The movie almost bombed at the box office. This thing has like a tenth of the viewership of the original series, and it feels like there's more discussion about the announcement of the sequel than the actual movie itself. So in order to figure out what exactly went wrong, let's actually revisit and explore this forgotten sequel of Code Geass. Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection starts off through what I assume is the celebration of its own comeback after an entire decade.
Welcome! It's been a while, hasn't it?
Right from the get-go, the movie introduces a lot of familiar characters who enjoy their time being alive during an unprecedented time of peace as a result of Lelouch's sacrifice a year ago. It's kind of weird how so many extremely important people from various nations are all gathered here at the Zero Cafe to just hang out like it's no big deal. But of course, they cannot just rely on nostalgia bait for the people to enjoy the entire movie. The plot needs to go somewhere. So within the first 3 minutes of this movie, Nanali and Suzaku, who's posing as Zero, are attacked by a terrorist group where Suzaku loses in record time. So much for being the world's best mecha pilot. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. Wait, is that? No way. C2 is on the run alongside Lelouch, whose mind has been reduced to a husk of what it once was. Basically, the first half of the story is all about recovering Lelouch's mind that is apparently trapped in C's world. So the plot in Resurrection is probably the last thing people care about since the title pretty much gives it away. But I think if I had to describe the tone for everything this movie is gonna be about, then this scene just speaks for itself.
And in more ways than one. Pizza girl, what are you doing in a place like this?
This movie is overly reliant on self-references and fan-service bait to grab the viewer's attention rather than focusing on the storytelling aspect, which is not really a flaw, but it's something to keep in mind going forward. After teaming up with Cullen and the gang, C2 heads out to the location where they can finally revive Lelouch, which happens to be in the same kingdom of Zizistan that kidnapped Suzaku and Nanali in the opening scenes. Eventually, they trick their enemies and find the gate that leads to C2's world. And as it turns out, there is a barrier in place that doesn't let Lelouch unite with his sense of self. Suddenly, the world around them begins to crumble, and after a lot of visually striking imagery, C2 alone gets sent back to the real world where Colin and the others have already been beaten up by the enemies. Then just as all hope seemed lost, and the characters are at the brink of despair.
Was a dead end after all.
No. On the contrary.
That's right, C2. The entire reason for the existence of the movie is here to save the day. Lelouch is back, baby, and in true Lelouch fashion, the first thing he does after regaining his ability is to order every living enemy in a 30-meter radius of his existence to kill themselves.
Now all of you, die! All of you, die! To kill yourself, right here.
Right now!
Now that the first plot point has been taken care of, the gang has to collectively take care of the other problem. And quite conveniently, Suzaku was being held captive in the same building that they are currently in. After they rescue him and Suzaku regains consciousness, the first thing Suzaku does after reuniting with his childhood friend who is also responsible for the happiness of the entire world is to of course beat the living shit out of him. So the movie has been a bit all over the place till now, but here comes probably the best part of the entire movie, and it has nothing to do with the story. Now that they are trapped in enemy territory, it's time for Lelouch to do some Lelouch things. And by that I mean stuff like Lelouch acting all smug in the enemy's face while strategizing the most efficient route to victory. Lelouch then makes the enemy think that they have the upper hand in the battle, and then he finishes things off in the most Lelouch way possible. As exciting as this entire sequence is, this is exactly what I mean when I say that this sequel is not about the story. There is nothing new or unique about the conflicts or even their resolutions. The story relies heavily on the same characters doing the same things rather than using them in a new and interesting setting to actually tell a story. In fact, they even turned Lelouch back into Zero for the rest of the movie under the guise that he's only doing this to save Nanali. No, Lelouch, Sunrise is doing this to make money through capitalizing off of you as a character. I mean, heck, they even brought back Shirley from the dead to add yet another character for the fans to look out for in this character-driven sequel. The entire point of creating those 3-part recap movies was apparently to set up this alternate timeline where Shirley lives through the events of R2. But then all she does in Resurrection is show up for like 20 seconds max throughout the movie, then disappear. Even the press gets more screen time than her. But there was a solid reason for keeping Shirley alive, since only she and Orange Boy were in on the entire plan of resurrecting Lelouch. You know, before inevitably the entire cast found out. But the thing is, the anime just hand-waves it away by simply describing Shirley's role in recovering Lelouch's body.
So Shirley recovered him. When things died down, she brought his body to a place Jeremiah set up.
Whatever, we're getting off track. Lelouch and the gang has finally made their exit from the enemy base, and now comes the part of the movie that is just filled to the brim with self-references. And I don't mean some subtle references that only the most keen viewer can spot. What I mean is that this segment, and by extension the entire movie, wears its references on its sleeve. The useless and nosy Tamaki is still the same as ever. The assistant of the Earl of Pudding still makes terrible food. Lelouch does that collar signal thing at Suzaku the same way he used to, and Orange Boy casually rocks up with a basket of oranges. Okay, I'll give you that last one. Now that everything has been taken care of and the only thing left to do is to rescue Nanali, I'll have to admit that the rest of the movie is actually pretty good in terms of story that is filled with some cool 2D mecha action and some classic Lelouch mind games. This is the part of the story that justifies its decently high rating despite the fact that many people hate this movie entirely. The second half introduces an all-new Geass ability that basically make these evil pair of siblings that threaten world peace just so overpowered. Oh right, I forgot to mention that this enemy kingdom has like a bunch of Geass users, so it makes sense why Suzaku lost so easily in the opening sequence. The princess of the enemy kingdom has a Geass ability the same kind as Subaru, which means Lelouch is at a significant disadvantage for most of the second half of this movie since all his plans repeatedly fail whenever she resets time. The second half of the story is really interesting to watch. It's a real shame they spent the first half of the movie on an empty plot point that only served as fanservice material. But I guess it's all good, since in the end, Lelouch unsurprisingly outwits his enemies, and after a long and hard-fought battle, the day is saved and peace has been once again restored in the world. Lelouch then resigns from being Zero, takes up the name L2, heads out on a new adventure with C2, and they live happily ever after. Lelouch of the Resurrection was anything but an original take on the Code Geass universe. All that this movie really did was introduce a lot of characters that possess the power of Geass, and then baited another sequel right at the end. Most of the movie revolved around exploring what the gang has been up to ever since Zero's Requiem. You know, since catching up to their everyday lives is probably more important for the fans than seeing an entirely new take on the franchise which relies on a unique story through utilizing these beloved characters, instead of revolving half the story around them. If you think I'm being a little too harsh on this movie, it's not like Code Geass is the only anime series that has been milked by his production company. There are other similarly popular and beloved titles out there that have received sequels to their perfectly closed stories. The real difference between those other titles and Resurrection is that they actually made the viewers care about the story and were as a result pretty well received by its audience. Whereas Resurrection is exactly like Lelouch at the beginning of the movie. This sequel feels like a brain-dead piece of entertainment when compared to the writing in the original Code Geass. It is honestly pretty enjoyable to look at, but it pales in comparison to what came before it. This sequel doesn't ruin the experience of the original anime, since it did go out of its way to create a different timeline altogether. But the real reason no one really seems to care about Resurrection is because of just how forgettable everything feels. There is still a lot of vague political notion and a greater mystery that the anime sometimes hints towards, but those scenes are mostly there to get people to watch the next season of Code Geass that they're gonna release as part of their 10-year plan, which means Sunrise themselves never planned on making this movie anything more than a setup piece for future sequels. Resurrection doesn't add anything fresh to the franchise, other than maybe selling the C2 and Lelouch ship right at the end, but the movie simultaneously doesn't fail at anything either. They tried taking the safest route by making a blatantly obvious fanservice movie, which makes the plot so easily forgettable since half the time you're just looking for what next reference are they gonna add. There wasn't something inherently bad about the story of Resurrection, and quite frankly, I did not hate or dislike anything in particular about the sequel movie, which makes sense because even if the sequel was more of a commercial money-making piece, the great minds behind the original anime are still the one making this movie. So even while familiar faces keep emerging left, right and center in this 2-hour-long sequel, their personality, reasonings and the way they interact with each other, especially after the events of Zero's Requiem, do not feel forced or unnecessary. And sure, the original anime series itself wasn't entirely so perfect either. Over the last decade, people have found countless flaws in the story, from convenient writing to Pizza Hut to that cat episode to just a lot of goofy moments that are sprinkled throughout the Code Geass story.
Right now, I have a school festival and a coup d'etat to run.
Okay, that's actually pretty funny. But the thing is, for all its flaws and failures, the original Code Geass is appreciated by me and by many others for its intense story, its incredible writing, and that iconic finale that completely and perfectly concluded the story of Code Geass in one of the most heartbreaking yet beautiful moments in anime's history. Code Geass never needed a sequel to its perfect ending, and that's part of the reason why no one talks about Lelouch of the Resurrection. At the end of the day, this movie is entirely for the fans. Sometimes, seeing more of the same characters you love to see interact or just exist is all that a person needs. And as a fan of the series myself, I won't lie that seeing them once again in action was honestly pretty exciting. You should watch the sequel movie for yourself if you feel like revisiting some old friends that you thought you could never meet again. Or you can choose to ignore its existence entirely, like many people probably do. Either way, it's fine as long as we agree that the original Code Geass is simply incredible. The cat episode was the best. Consider subscribing and comment below your personal feelings toward Code Geass. Should be interesting to read. That's it. Thanks for watching.